Okay, we are going to jump right in for the few of you that are following along. And if you're unfamiliar with what this is about, you can check out the channel or look at the description below. But we are finishing up the book of Joshua this week and moving into the book of Judges. I mentioned last week that the second half of the book of Joshua is fairly disappointing in terms of its lack of action, especially compared to the first half that is about conquering of the land. You get to the second half, right here around chapter 14 up to 24. It's mostly a list of the kings that were conquered, and then large portion of the book devoted to the division of the land, telling you exactly what part of the land was allotted to each tribe as their inheritance. So it's a little bit tough to get through, but I do want us to notice that this second half of Joshua is fairly positive in the description that it gives of the conquering of the land. It talks about how God had done everything according to what he had promised, right? That he had given them rest from their enemies. Now they are finally dwelling in the land that God had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And there is this air of triumph and of relief as the people live in the land that God has given to them. And the stories that we have in the second part of Joshua, for instance, Caleb going up and conquering the giants to win his portion of the inheritance, they are positive stories. They are stories that are filled with hope and with victory. At the end of the book, it sounds a lot like the end of the book of Deuteronomy. We talked last week about Moses passing the torch to Joshua, and in his own way, now Joshua has his moment at the end of the book to encourage the people going forward to be faithful to God, but also to give them that warning that they will find it hard to be faithful to God and to keep the commandments of his covenant. And in fact, as you turn the page into the book of Judges, that's exactly what you see coming to pass. The worst warnings of Moses and now Joshua are coming to fruition as the people depart from their faithfulness to God. And the reason for that is largely laid at the feet of the failure of the people to drive out the enemies that are living in the land of Canaan. Remember, they were supposed to remove all these influences from them. The people taking the land of Canaan was, as God told Abraham all the way back in Genesis, it was largely a judgment on these people for their wickedness and for their idolatry. And so the people were supposed to purify the land, but they didn't do that. And so what the text of Judges says in chapter 2 is that these people became a thorn in the side of the Israelites because they didn't drive them out. And a lot of that first part of Judges is devoted to that very thing. The people failed to drive out the enemies, and so that influence comes back to really be their ruin and their downfall. But that's not the only thing that's said about the failure of the people. There is this powerful statement made a little bit later on in chapter 2 when it says that they were faithful in the time of Joshua, but then another generation arose that did not know the Lord and didn't know all the things that he had done. And I think that's just a powerful lesson about the passing from one generation to the next and what can happen when there aren't leaders to lead the people. When the people forget what it is that God has done, they haven't learned those lessons. Remember how much of Deuteronomy was devoted to teaching your children. And Joshua, when they crossed over the Jordan River, they put up the stones to tell their children what it was that God had done. And that was lost now. And this new generation didn't know the Lord. And so instead, they replaced the worship of Jehovah with the worship of the Baals and the other idols influenced by the people that were still living in the land of Canaan. And that's what sets off this cycle. And the way that's described in Judges 3 is a little bit interesting. It says that these enemies that God sent to Israel, says that it was to test Israel. I'm not exactly sure what this means, but it could be that this is the discipline of God, that he is sending them enemies to try to correct them, to show them the consequences of being unfaithful to him and breaking his commandments. And so the people sin and enemies come, and God has to, when they cry out, raise up a judge. We see several judges here before we get to chapter 6. Othniel, Ehud, and Shamgar in chapter 3. Deborah and Barak in chapters 4 and 5, and then Gideon starting in chapter 6. And each of these stories is the same thing: a departure from God, an enemy comes, God trying to discipline his people. They'll turn to him and he'll send a deliverer, but then the whole cycle starts over again. And so when you look at the book of Joshua moving to Judges, you see what happens when a people forgets God, and we see God starting to act with his people in a way to discipline them, to warn them, to send prophets to them. And this is really going to be the story of Israel for the rest of their history. And next week, we'll read the rest of the book of Judges to see how this plays out in this specific moment. But for now, that's the end of Joshua, the beginning of Judges. Please subscribe and check back next Monday for the next week of our 2020 Bible reading.